Welcome to the Shamanism Global Summit, an extraordinary gathering of teachers and healers from around the planet, sharing insights, principles, and rituals for personal and collective healing and transformation. Please share this event with your friends and family, and come join us on Facebook at The Shift Network. And now your host, Michael Stone.
Welcome to the Shamanism Global Summit. This is your host, Michael Stone, and I am very excited about my guest today. Betsy Bergstrom is a full-time teacher and practitioner of shamanism, mediumship, sacred constellations, and energy healing. Her groundbreaking work in middle world healing of compassionate deep possession and curse and thought form unraveling have become mainstay practices for many shamanic practitioners. She has a passion for helping the living and the dead reconnect with the love and light that is our birthright. Betsy, welcome.
Hello. I'm glad to be speaking with you today.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. So let's just jump in there and start talking about what is possession from a shamanic perspective.
Possession from that kind of shamanic perspective can happen when, if we look at kind of a sort of a common or garden variety form of possession that we might encounter, it could happen when somebody dies, a human being dies, and there can be a problem with something going on for them that doesn't allow them to cross over, and they become a discarnate spirit. And then what can happen is that discarnate spirit can find themselves attracted to or attached to a living person, and that usually happens in the energetic or the etheric field. As well, some kinds of possession can happen not from dead people or dead human beings, but they might be other kinds of beings that might not necessarily be dead, but don't have bodies in the way that human beings have dense bodies. So possession is something that has been recognized in societies around the world, and for as long as human beings have been writing, one of the topics that humans have written about is the possibility of what can happen after death, and that part of that possibility might be that the dead people that can find themselves becoming a possessing being.
So how does one become possessed? Are we particularly vulnerable at some places and at some times in our life? Can you talk a little bit about the actual possession, and is it something that happens often, or is this just an occasional thing that happens?
When I first began this work, I was under the impression that it didn't happen very often and that it was probably quite rare. What I've found after doing this work for more than 20 years is that it's a lot less common than one might like to think, and that in some ways, just as there can be occasions of parasites happening in the regular world, there can also be that type of thing happening in the spiritual or the energetic world. And the way that when some of the ways that human beings might find themselves in the experience of having a possession occur for them, that can happen in a number of different ways. One of the ways that it might happen is when somebody becomes quite ill. And one of the things that can happen when we become ill is we become devitalized, and our etheric field doesn't have the resilience or the strength that it might normally have. And a discarnate being, or a being that's looking for a place to be, or is finding itself consciously or unconsciously gravitating towards what might feel like a source of light or a source of some kind of energy, they might find themselves attracted to a person who doesn't have a strong energetic field, and therefore they don't have the kind of boundaries or barriers that a person might normally have. Occasionally, and this happens and occurs in cultures where there are active forms of sorcery, for instance, it's a not uncommon practice for people who are trying to harm another to actually send a discarnate being to actually intentionally possess someone. One of the other ways that people might find themselves being possessed is if they are practicing some kind of an undisciplined or uninformed practice of channeling or mediumship where they don't really know what they're doing and they don't have proper safeguards. And that is something that people sometimes find themselves wanting to explore and unintentionally and inadvertently perhaps calling to themselves a spirit that isn't a high-level spirit but might actually be a being that can become a possessing spirit. And then one of the things that I've really become much more aware of in the last few years is that quite a bit of the possession that I've been seeing lately is possession that I think actually has its origins in the ancestral field. And when we talk about the ancestral field, we're talking about our ancestors, the people that we're descendants from. And one of the things that can occur is that when our grandparents or somebody else in the ancestral field, it can be much farther back than that, have an experience maybe in war or in experiencing some kind of violence or violent death, they themselves might become possessed. And sometimes those possessions, at the time of death of that ancestor, those possessions can get passed down to some of the living, some of the people that might be around them or are connected to them in their life. And so one of the things that I've become aware of is that sometimes possessions get passed down through family systems.
Oh, that's interesting. I want to come back to that in a minute, but I want to say that it seems to me that our movies have given a bad rap to possession in many ways, and I want to talk about the difference between the kind of exorcist demonic possession and what mostly you talk about and seems to be more prevalent is the earthbound spirits who haven't crossed over. Can you distinguish those two and talk a little bit about the characteristics of them?
Yes. When I first began this work a number of years ago, I was aware that people either didn't believe in possession at all or they thought that possession was going to look like something from The Exorcist. And when we talk about The Exorcist, we're talking about a possession of by a spirit, or oftentimes it's a group of spirits that actually have a lot of energy, what many indigenous people might call different types of supernatural beings with supernatural abilities and powers, and which in Christian terms have been called demons. And when we look at demons and we look at the origins of who those demons might actually be, one of the things that I've found quite interesting was that some of the powerful middle world spirits that were beings that different indigenous peoples had awarenesses of were beings that became, in a sense, kind of demonized by various religions. And so when I talk about demons, I'm very careful to be aware that not all demons fit the sort of demonic or satanic kind of characterization that Christianity or other religions would confer upon them. Sometimes there are other types of supernatural beings, but those types of possessions are often have a flavor of what we could call great evil. Those possessions are sometimes very deliberate, and usually the possession or the possessing beings are quite conscious of the fact that they're possessing someone, and those possessions can have if you're in the presence of a person who has a possession like that, they might have a great and there's a lot of feeling of confusion, and there can be an emanation of great heaviness or a lot of turbulence around them. And I have found in my practice that, I have encountered some of those types of possession, and and I certainly have done my research on those types of possession to see the ways that other people might have, other practitioners might have tried to work with those types of beings. And one of the typical ways that people work with those types of beings or have in the past is through another form of depossession, which is often called exorcism. And there's a sense of trying to have power over those kinds of beings, to really cast them out, or to, and often these beings are maybe worked with, maybe the people who do the exorcism work or the clearing work are priests or people who feel a religious calling to really work with this particular type of being. And unfortunately, I think one of the ways that these beings are often met is because they themselves have a power and sometimes a true darkness to them, and sometimes are quite angry. That they're often met very forcefully, and so those forceful interactions often are really difficult for everybody, difficult for the practitioner, difficult for the client, and possibly very difficult for the being themselves. More often, what I find in my practice is that the possessing spirits that I encounter, well, in the first years of my practice, I would say the possessing spirits that I encountered were usually human beings. And it really changed my practice from being, for me, a desire to really help my clients, which I have carried, is carried through in my work throughout the whole time, is I do have a strong desire to help my client. And then because I was a bit afraid in this work initially, my sense about who those beings were that were possessing the client, it was that I was very uncertain about who they might be. And then over the years, what I began to find is that they were generally people also, that they were people who had either died in a state of confusion, or they were people who perhaps had committed suicide and felt as though the light or heaven wasn't actually even open to them, or that they were people that maybe had died in a state of confusion because they were on a lot of medications, or they had died of a sudden death and really didn't even know they were dead. And one of the things that I found with these types of possession was that I really had to become aware that as I began working with with these possessing spirits, that I had to regard them as people too, not as parasites, not as entities, not as not as something other, but as beings like me who either through some mischance had become ghosts, and were not able to cross over, or in the case of some of those beings, they because part of the process of compassionate depossession, or the work that I do and that I teach, includes actually having a dialogue with the possessing spirits. One of the things that I began to learn from the possessing spirits was that sometimes in the process of death, they experienced a life review. And this life review is something that's mentioned by people who've had near-death experiences and then came back from them. And one of the things that would happen sometimes for people in the dying process is that they would have this life review, and they would see the things that they felt weren't so good in their life. And I personally feel that the life review is absolutely without judgment, that it's just a factual opportunity to look at what happened in this particular life, and that it's actually overseen by our soul guides. And but that if we, as a human being, have our own fears and our own biases and our own filters, one of the things that might happen as we see this life review is that we may think that we're not worthy of crossing over, or that the light, the going to heaven or wherever our destination that would be a favorable destination, we might feel it's not really an option for us. And so what happens for these beings is sometimes is that they actually see the angelic help, they see the psychopomp beings, and psychopomp, for those of you who don't know that word, is a Greek word that translated means the conductor of souls. And so human people can be psychopomps, like I would consider myself to be a psychopomp being because of the work that I do, but also there are angelic and ancestral and animal guide psychopomp beings, many different kinds of psychopomp beings. So one of the things that can happen for the dying or the deceased person is that they might even be aware of the psychopomp beings, but they're afraid of where they're going to take them, and so they don't go anywhere, and they just stay here as earthbound beings. And then sometimes what can happen for that earthbound being is that, especially, right around the time of death, there's still some life force in a way that's left over from their physical body, and within a matter of days, usually the physical body is destroyed, and the energy, the etheric energy that's still left with that soul will begin to dissipate over time. And as that energy dissipates, as that etheric energy dissipates, that soul may find itself not really being able to be aware of what's happening around them. And so for some of those people, they just become ghosts. They just stay wherever it is that they are, maybe at the place that they died or a place that they really like, or it can be just where they happen to be when their real sense of themselves really dissolved away because of that, the dissolution of that life force that was allowing them to have some kind of sense of themselves. And then possession can happen when they might find themselves sort of gravitating towards somebody that feels familiar. And I don't mean, it could be somebody that actually was familiar. For instance, if it was a dead relative, a grandmother that doesn't pass over, maybe she doesn't want to leave. Maybe she's worried about her daughter and her grandchildren, and so her care causes her to stay and not go with the psychopomp beings. Over time, what might happen for her is that attachment that she has towards the living can actually cause her to become attached to the living and, to kind of miss that opportunity to go with the psychopomp beings. And what I've found is that different kinds of attachments are the things that cause people to stay here. So sometimes it's fear of where they would go if they go anywhere. They don't want to go to a hell realm or some kind of a difficult realm like that. For some people, it can be a strong attachment to their life itself, like they really just can't get over it, that their life is gone. For some beings, they may be so webbed to the living, so connected through cords, that they're simply not able to. And you see this happen sometimes when people are when people are dying and the family is not able to, the close loved ones around them are not really able to let go of them, for their own feelings about their loss. The imminent losses are so strong that they really cling to that person. And sometimes through that clinging, this kind of courting can happen. And then through this courting, sometimes we actually can keep people alive longer than they really are meant to be alive, or longer than they would be able to be without, being sourced from our life. And so what can happen for that person is it's really difficult for them to go because they're so webbed to the living, and then unfortunately they can become a possessing spirit.
Wow, fascinating. So much. There's so much now. You've opened up hundreds of questions. I want to get back to the process of depossession and exorcism in a minute, but I'd like to step back and get a historical perspective, because I think it's challenging for some people, even people who are shamanic practitioners, to step out of the kind of Newtonian Cartesian worldview that if we can't touch it, feel it, measure it, even though they do journey work, that this is challenging. So, and I think the church has made it even more confusing with how they've looked at it. But can you take us back to the early times of discovery and the rituals and the way there seems to be some consensus in in diverse cultures around the world of this passing over and the need to be a psychopomp or an assistant in traveling to the other worlds when we're not in our body.
Yeah. One of the things that I think that people, a starting place for anyone, I think, is to think about the possibility of ghosts. And most people have had either a personal encounter of a ghost or they know somebody who's had an encounter of a ghost. So that's often the starting place. It's like if you can allow yourself to think that that could be true, then why wouldn't possession be true? And I think just as now, there are people like myself and like other shamanic practitioners, other healers, other intuitives, other empaths, other people who have kind of an awareness that there is more going on in the world around us than is actually seen. As you're talking about the way that our kind of scientific or mechanistic view of things. But earlier on, people were very aware of the spirit world. And just as many of us, especially as we get older in our life and we're approaching what might be the time of our own crossing, we really get interested in what happens after death. And so that kind of question occupied humankind from the earliest days. And I think for humans, in every, society, in every place around the world, there were people who had the ability to be aware of more things, whether they were gifted with what I call the clairs, clairvoyance, clairsentience, claircognition, clairempathy, clairolfactory, whatever kind of clair it might be. I think that there were always people who were aware that and could report to their community about what they saw and what they witnessed. And so one of the things that I found fascinating in researching possession and possession illness and its impact around the world was to find that as soon as people were starting to write, that one of the things that interested them was what happens after death, and also the steps that people might take. I mean, the concept of possession or the experience of possession was something that people witnessed happening and began to really take steps to try to prevent. And in a sense, I would say they recognized that it was a possibility. If I step back and look at it, I could say under certain circumstances it would be normal for it to happen. And so what people wanted to do was to prevent those kinds of circumstances from happening. I mean, recognizing that possession's not good for anybody. Now, having said that, I want to just do a little aside and say some religions or spiritual societies around the world believe in voluntary possession, allowing themselves to be temporarily possessed, but generally they learn how to become possessed and then how to become unpossessed. And so, that making sure that you get clear of it is something that's very important. And so that also, I think, informs the population. If people allow themselves to be possessed by an ancestor who might give them a particular kind of wisdom, or allow themselves to embody, we could call it possession, a deity or someone like that. So those types of experiences are things that we know also that early humans and developing civilizations were experiencing. So what I believe, I really do find is that that the rituals that we have at the time of death, and the ritual that certainly has carried over into present time, although in some ways we're losing it a bit, is that of the funeral, of having a particular time after a person has died to, and different rituals that we might do to help that deceased person to not only become fully deceased, and when I say that, I mean fully detached from the living, fully detached from their body, made aware through some of the rituals, like the ritual of the washing of the body. Those were rituals that were not just done in secret, but they were often rituals that were done in the home, and they were done by family members. And the grieving of the family member was often a way of letting, it was a genuine expression of grief, but it also also was a way of letting the deceased know that they're really dead and that a change has occurred for them. And so when a funeral or some kind of a celebration or memorial would happen, part of what was happening was that people were celebrating the life and the loss of this person, but they were also those ceremonies were to explicitly let that dead person know that you're dead, and we're mourning you. We're going through these rituals, and you know these rituals, and these rituals are for you. And so that allowed them to be aware of perhaps the next part of the process. And the next part of the process was that oftentimes different communities, different societies, different groups of people had a strong cosmology, a strong understanding of what was going to happen for the deceased person after death. And that cosmology might be that they get on a boat and they cross over to a particular direction, and part of the way that the mimicking of what was happening in the energy world might be that for the Viking people, they might have been burned on a boat. Those burnings, the burning of a body was a way that humans believed that the spirit could be released more effectively from a physical body. In Tibet and in different parts of Mongolia, the sky burials where because the permafrost and the ground is so hard that if people die during the cold months of the year, the bodies are actually cut up and offered to the vultures for the vultures to eat them. And that dismembering and the eating up of the flesh of those deceased people was a way of freeing that soul from the body. And also that was one of the ways of making sure that the being knew they were dead but also couldn't stick around here. In some of the Native American and indigenous people in North America, the platform burials where they were offered to the sky, they were put in particular places. There were particular ceremonies that happened for them. And once again, that offering of the elements, other people was part of the ritual or the ceremony. And same thing might happen, different rituals of fire, many different, just as we're cremating people now, people have cremated people in the past, and that that also has been a way of helping to release them from their body. Same thing with water. Some people used to be put into the water, and allow the fishes or the different beings to eat their body. But one of the things I think that's happening now is that we don't always have a great cosmology. People believe in heaven, or many people don't grow up believing in heaven at all. And we don't always have a sense of the fact that there are psychopomp beings who can help us. And one of the things that I became very intrigued about and very interested was that as I began to be aware of possession happening through the ancestral field, I also became aware that there were psychopomp beings who were part of our ancestral field. And so, part of having a cosmology would be to know that there are particular psychopomp beings that help your family. And so when it's your time to keep the lookout for that being, and that being will be there to help you, as will indeed many beings be there to help you.
Wow, there's just so much information that's been lost, that we could talk for hours here about this. And one of the ways I think that it's been lost, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about, is the commercial institutional death trade has created a particular cosmology that says death is a problem that we need to deal with, and we need to prolong life because death is the end. And it's prevalent in mainstream culture, Western culture, that this is that death is a problem to be dealt with. I'd like to hear you take some time to talk about what a good death would be and how preparing for death, even at an early age, really can add more meaning and purpose to our life by embracing death way before that time comes. Could you talk about that?
Yes. one of the things that really occurs to me is that that whether it's through institutions or whether it's through our own aversions, that we have become very unfamiliar with death, that we don't handle people's bodies generally ourselves when they die. They're given over to somebody else to handle. We don't, we often find, maybe more now with hospice, we're finding that, but for a time, I think that people often died in an institution, not at home necessarily, especially if they had some kind of an illness. And other people cared for that person who was dying rather than the family. And so there might be real kind of lack of familiarity with death. And I think that one of the things that that earlier on people had was a sense that death was a part of life, and that it happens, and you don't know when it's going to happen, and that one of the things that's happened for us, which is a blessing, and but it's maybe a mixed blessing in different ways, is that we have ways of prolonging life, of being healthier, and I'm not sure why, but I think maybe we put off thinking about death and aren't entirely comfortable with it. And a good death, one of the very first deaths that I had a chance to witness was the death of my grandmother. And now my grandmother was the elder who had really noticed that I had intuitive or psychic or spiritual gifts, and she herself was a really spiritual woman. She had studied, she had just had a great interest. She was very eclectic in spiritual terms. She'd been part of the truth-speaking movement of the 30s and 40s. She was a woman who was born in 1891, and so she believed in affirmations. Then she'd studied with the spiritualist church, and she'd also studied science of mind, but she became a theosophist also. I mean, she really had a wide-ranging interest in spirituality, and what she had, I think that really also sparked her interest in it was that my mother, her only child, had had a near-death experience when she was a teenager, and she really did nearly die of rheumatic fever. And the experience that she had was that her deceased father came for her, that she was beginning to cross over into a place of great beauty where music was playing and the light was very muted and it felt like it was full of love, and her father was waiting for her. And that's a very classic aspect of the cosmology that people might have, that, the loved ones, people that you recognize, are waiting for you, so you don't have to be afraid to die. And then what my mother's experience was that her aunt, who was sitting at her bedside, reached through, grabbed her hand, and pulled her back from that place. And what my mother's father said to her was, "It's not your time, but I'll be waiting for you when it is." And so for my grandmother, she had a first-hand report of what one of the first steps of what happens to us after death, by that that experience that my mother had, and it really it gave her a lot of confidence to be able to face her own death, and it gave all of us in my family a lot of confidence to face our own death, to have that sense of what's going to happen. Now, if you look at the cosmologies that are intact around the world, they vary from each other. Often there's somebody that's familiar, but the direction that a deceased person goes to, the people that meet them, the kinds of things that might happen to them may all be culturally specific to different people, but they have commonalities. And the commonalities are that there's a need to detach from this particular life, that you're met by somebody who you immediately are able to feel and sense is very trustworthy, and that these are people that you want to be with and go towards, and that the process can happen very, very easily, very gradually, and that one of the things that I've found, especially in doing depossession work, is I want to be very sensitive about where exactly, what does the suffering being that I'm working with, what do they believe? Do they want to go up? Is that where their people go? Do they want to go down into the earth? Which is not going into the hell realm, but it's more like going into the lower world, or they're into the deep, rich earth, or they might go to the west, or they might go to the north, and those particular directions are really important to them. So for us to take the time to get a sense of what do my people do, what do they believe, what's part of my culture, what's part of my own soul experience, because we're not only the sum total of what comes to us through the ancestral field, but we also have what we've experienced in our previous lives as well. And I love to look at the stories of people who have died and come back, and to hear what they experience, which can be stories of utmost simplicity. A friend told me about a man who died while in the hospital, and he came back to life 20 minutes later. And when she had, my friend who was a nurse had a chance to ask this man, well, what did you experience? Did you see a light? Did you see a tunnel? And he said, no, I met myself, and I can't wait to be myself again.
Wow.
Very simple man, but and that was his experience, was very simple. He just knew this is what he wanted to be. And I think when we have that kind of sense about what's possible for us, the Dalai Lama, in the practice of Poa, which is a Tibetan practice of what can happen at the time of death, and the possibilities of, it's quite a spiritual technology that Tibetan Buddhism has, and a very studied understanding about what happens at the time of death through their cultural lens. But the Dalai Lama practices dying in maybe a dozen different ways daily as part of his practice, so that he'll retain awareness when it actually happens. And by having a sense of where, what could happen, and also, just that deep sense of worthiness that good things can happen for you when you die. One of the things that I've found in practicing compassionate depossession, and it came as a surprise to me, was to find that whether the possessing spirit was somebody's, my client's grandmother, who for whatever reason hadn't been able to cross over, or whether they were a really phenomenal kind of supernatural being, every being that I've encountered has the same light of the Creator in them. And what that really began to give me was the awareness and a deep reassurance that we actually all have that light within us is part of the guide. And so it isn't just about getting help from the outside world, but it's actually allowing ourselves to divest our attachments in this world, so that light that's inherent in us begins to unfold, and so we meet the process just as the process meets us in dying.
Oh, that's so brilliant. I love that. I have to say, Betsy, when you were talking about your grandmother and her story, it just was so true in my physical body, which, I'm the person about embodied shamanism, and it just rang so true. But also in my emotional body, I could just feel the truth of that experience there, and how we all have access to that. And we're getting close to the end of our time, and so many more things I want to talk about. But I would like you to walk us through the difference between depossession and exorcism, as if you were going to do either of those, and also how one would protect themselves in that process. Could you just take us on a little journey of how that process goes, starting with the client and then going through the process and doing the depossession or the exorcism, and how we can protect ourselves? If I'm not suggesting someone should do this, but so that they would know the process and what to expect if someone came to you to have this or sent someone to you.
Okay. Well, I would only want to talk briefly about the process of exorcism because I don't do it, so I can only say that I'll tell you what I know about it, and if I'm not correct about it, I do apologize. And I also want to say right now, too, that exorcism and every other form of depossession is something that I have a tremendous amount of gratitude for because they're part of the underpinnings of the work that I do, and that the desire to help the client is true in every case. In what I understand to be true about exorcism, I think sometimes the suffering being, which is what I call the possessing spirit, is often seen to be some kind of other than us, other than human, and often it's seen to be a being of immense power, and the feelings in an exorcism is a bit adversarial. There's a sense of we have to summon as much power as we can to and connect with what is true and all the resources that are available to us to pull out or to drive this being out of the person that they're afflicting and affecting. And one of the things that can happen, I think, in any kind of forceful work like that is the same thing that would happen in with living people. If you try to attack somebody, and exorcism sometimes is forceful prayer, forceful incantations, depending on where the exorcism is happening. Sometimes it's even a beating of the client, trying to intentionally beat the suffering being out of the client, and that is very terrifying and confusing. And even, so if you were doing that to some being who has a lot of power, one of the things that might happen is that being might fight back. And so, unfortunately, in exorcism, there's sort of an experience that I think is a bit common where the being does react, and the process then can be difficult for the client and also difficult for the practitioner. And there's sort of expected to be a kind of a struggle in it, but good will prevail, and so I'm not a very, in regular life, in the real world, I'm not a very big person. I'm a small woman, and so I'm not about to try to overpower somebody, especially when I have no idea how big they are and what kind of power they might have. In compassionate depossession, when a person comes, one of the things that I'm aware of, that when, if a client has something that I think is a component of spiritual illness, that they have a possessing spirit with them, is that I enlist the aid of the client to be part of the process and to know that this isn't something that I'm going to be doing to them and to the client, and to the being, but that the client and I are going to be doing this together, and we also are certainly working hand in hand with the psychopomp beings, because this work can't be done by me. It's really I find myself sort of more in a midwife role than I do as the person who's actually doing the work. And so part of my work is to set the space up and hold a really safe space for this work to unfold in, and also to have a great deal of certainty within me about what's going to be happening. And that I also have come to find, Michael, that by the time a client comes to me and they have a possessing spirit that we're that's ready to be worked with, that the process is actually already well underway. And that part of that, and so I recognize that they wouldn't even be sitting in the room with me if the possessing spirit wasn't already in agreement with what's going to be happening, and that the movement hasn't already started, because it has. And so, because beings can be submerged within people for a long time, and by the time a client begins to be aware of its presence, that movement is already happening towards resolution. And so one of the things that I have to convey, and I have learned over time to have a lot of confidence in this work is I want to convey to the client and to the suffering being that I'm really certain that this can work. I've done this work for a long time, and I also have an utmost certainty that that client has the light of the Creator in them, just as does that suffering being have the light of the Creator. And so what we invite then are many, many helping spirits to come and to begin to really offer incredible kindness to the suffering being and to begin to really pour their light into the client and into the suffering being. And as that light connects with the light of the angels and the psychopomp beings connects with the light that's in the heart of the suffering being, a natural occurrence begins, which is they begin to unfold from the client very, very literally and very often quite easily. And as that light and that radiance in them grows simply by being witnessed, one of the things that I think is a very important part of this work is the witnessing. For some reason, this didn't work for people before. Their crossing was delayed in some way, and now it's time. And so the witnessing that the client is in a position to be able to offer, and the witnessing that I offer, as well as the help of the psychopomp beings, really begins to naturally allow this being to really just gently unfold from the person. And really, because sometimes possession illness has been an overshadowing of some of the difficulties of that, the deceased being or whatever other kind of being they might be, in the way that they have become fused or integrated with the client, we take time to make sure that that gets really disconnected and drawn out of the client so that nothing is left with them. But also, I'm very aware that one of the powerful things that happens for the possessing spirit themselves is that they often have had a tremendous anxiety about whether this is actually going to work for them, whether they're worthy, whether redeemable, whatever word you might want to use. And so we're holding that certainty for them, like, yes, this is your right. You've always had the light of the Creator in you. This always could have happened, but now it's happening, and now is the time. And so, through these combined efforts, also, I'm very aware that a pathway opens up and a particular threshold to the appropriate place for that being opens for them. And often the suffering being is very aware of it. And the client, meantime, is 100% aware of all of this that's happening. And so the client actually gets an opportunity to be aware of the psychopomp beings, to be aware of the threshold, to be aware of something of the state of mind and the kind of nature of the possessing spirit, which has been overshadowing them. We haven't talked so much about that. But, and so that often is very healing for the client to be aware of, oh, that was all their stuff. That was all their anxiety. That was all their anger. That was all their fear. And that, so they really feel that leaving them. And then I'm very clear that the being, as they're crossing, doesn't have to take that anger and anxiety with them. And so there's a detaching of that happens not in the client but outside of the client. And so there's such a lightening up of the possessing spirit, and sometimes it's a question of slowing the process down to make sure that everything is as complete as it needs to be, because they often just want to zoom away to the light. So.
Oh, so beautiful, Betsy. It almost makes me want to be possessed just so I can experience it with you. That's so great. I want to tell people that we're going to need to end here in a minute, but you can own this for yourself. You can listen to it over the next 48 hours, but you can own it for yourself by going to shamanismsummit.com/upgrade. And there's so much in here, and there's so many more questions, but unfortunately, we're out of time. And I just want to say for all of our listeners, Betsy, deep, deep gratitude. Your love of spirit and your commitment to be of service is palpable, and I just honor that and appreciate your taking the time to be with us here on the this year's Shamanism Global Summit. So deep gratitude and thanks to you.
Oh, thank you so very much for this. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about this, about something that's so important to me. So thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you. You take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Shamanism Global Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network.